internet gremlins are out to get me today. I was in the middle of talking and then I lost connection. Um,
Okay.
Suzanne, do you want me to give just a quick introduction? I'm not
I
sure.
just said that, yes,
Yeah.
actually, we just started the recording. Welcome to Critical Time Intervention for Rapid Rehousing, and Shelby Ferguson. Oops, is going to be giving us a welcome.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, hi, everyone. Just want to welcome you to the CTI training. Thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to be able to offer this training for you all. This is for all of our rapid rehousing providers. So hoping that you get lots out of it. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat or use the raise hand function. Try to keep yourself on mute if you can, but really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a great training.
Thanks, Shelby, and thanks for inviting us to do this session. Andrea and I, as I said, are based in New York, but we've done lots of work in California and love working with you guys out there. And we've done work in your area over the last couple of years quite a bit, although not in person. So we have it's all been virtual and remote. But we'll get there. There'll be some time. So Andrea and I are from Housing Innovations. We are very old social workers. Let me just start with that, who have practiced in the field of homelessness for decades, many decades. We have done direct service and run all sorts of programs, housing programs, shelter, transitional outreach, screwed up a lot of employment programs, things like that. So we have done a lot of practice, and we continue to support a lot of organizations like yours in doing the work in the field. So we hopefully are providing you guys with relevant information that you can use right away, because we do know that you're busy, that you have a lot going on, and that you're taking time out of your busy days for this training. So we really want to make it meaningful for you. Andrea and I do a lot of work with Housing Innovations as a small firm, and we really do everything soup to nuts on homelessness, from training maybe your front desk staff to doing program evaluation, to training clinical staff, to working with systems and community planning and continuums of care. So we are national and occasionally international. And critical time intervention is an evidence-based practice, and you'll learn a lot more about that. There is a Center for the Advancement of CTI at Hunter School of Social Work, and Andrea and I are on the steering committee for that center, and we are approved CTI trainers to do this work. And we've really spent a couple of decades on this practice of CTI, and really excited that it got adapted to rapid rehousing programs like you guys are working in. So, and we were part of creating the new model for rapid rehousing, because it started out as a model really focused more on permanent supportive housing. So I already talked about the goals, that we want to give you information that's relevant. We're hopeful that you will take away things today that will be a gift to you in your work in some way. We know it's hard to be on camera, believe me. You know, sometimes you don't feel camera ready, and we get that. But if you would turn on your cameras as much as you can, as much as you're comfortable with, no pressure, no judgments here. We have a couple of breakouts. So during the breakouts, you may want to go on camera so you can see your colleagues. Make sure you put your name the way you'd like us to be addressed. I know that's not always what it comes up on your screen. We did send out the slides or attach them to the appointment. So hopefully a lot of you were able to access them, but we'll also pop them, the slides and the handouts, into the chat in a minute or two. As you might be able to tell from just this first couple of minutes with us, we really do love to talk to people in the field. This is not hard science. There's a lot of art to this work. So we want to have interaction. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what's worked for you. We want to hear your questions. We have polls. We have breakouts, but don't wait for that. If you have something to say, please raise your hand or type it in the chat or just shout out. We don't need to be extra formal, and you already know that the session is being recorded. So you'll have it for the future. What are we going to do today? So this is a 5-part series, every week, same time, same place, to go over the critical time intervention model. So we'll do a little bit of time on introductions. We will overview the CTI model kind of from the top level, just to give everybody kind of a shared understanding of the concept. We'll talk about how CTI is really a very effective practice with housing stability with people, which is really one of your main goals in your rapid rehousing programs. And then we'll start diving deeper into the practice of CTI. CTI has recommended assessment domains and a recommended service planning approach. And we'll start by working on the assessment domains today and looking at how that really does assess through the lens of housing stability for people. And then we'll wrap it up. And as I said, in the middle, we have a couple of breakouts and a couple of polls. So we'd like to do a little introductions, and we're going to change it up from the way we have it written on the slide. This is a big group. How many are you now? 27 people. So having people type this in the text in the chat box is really not going to be very interesting. So we're going to do a little breakout session. And we're just going to randomly assign you to meet with a few of your colleagues. Say hello, introduce yourself, where you're from, talk a little bit about your experience in the field, and then share your favorite ice cream flavor. I know it's morning, so for some of you, you might not be thinking of ice cream. I also know for some of you, you think about ice cream all the time. And some of you may never think about ice cream. But it was hot when we were writing these slides, and it's still hot now. And I think it's hot where you are. So at least it'll be a little bit of a cooling thought. All right, so we'll give you about, 5 minutes. I'm going to, where if I can find breakout rooms. Yes. Split you up just randomly, and I hope you meet some new people, or maybe you'll see your own some of your own colleagues from your program. Welcome back, everybody. Anybody here any exciting new ice cream flavors they want to try? Just wait another second till everybody gets back.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody's here. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully that was a nice little chance to chat with people and say hello, talk about what the work a little bit and not too much, and then talk about ice cream, which is usually fun. But I've heard some, normally when we do it in the chat box, I've heard some really great new flavors, but I like chocolate, just in case anyone wants to know. Chocolate, anything. All right. So getting serious a little bit, but it's always good to kind of get our brains to clear out from the morning, whatever you brought with you today to the session, and start fresh a little bit. But what is this practice? I'm sure some of you know of it. It is an evidence-based practice, so it's proven in the research to work, and it's really about helping people get through transitions. The transition that you're working on is the transition from homelessness to housing and to house status. But it's been used in helping people make other transitions, like from psychiatric facilities to the community or jail or prison, because it focuses on providing extra support around the transition, which is times of stress for people, and building connections and networks of support. And whenever we make a transition, if you get a new job, if you get a new relationship, if you move into a new house, your networks change up a little bit. And you might have to develop some new skills, and certainly, or recover skills maybe that you forgot about before. And so the practice really focuses on helping people really learn how to manage their lives, manage their tendencies, and also have support to get through the good times and the bad. It has been proven to be successful in helping people make transitions into the community, reducing returns to homelessness, reducing use of emergency services and institutions. We do have at the end, in case I don't get to mention it, some citations for research on CTI. I know some of you like to read, and that's how you learn. And there is a Critical Time website, which we also have linked to if you want to read more about any of the studies that have gone on. The work on CTI with rapid rehousing is newer. it's really been the last 5 years or so that it's been applied. So you won't find as much of the peer-reviewed research on that, because it takes 5 years for them to study anything and get a report out. And by then, 5 years, so much has changed. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out. Rapid rehousing, you guys are paving the way. CTI is very compatible with other practices you are probably using in your agencies. And it incorporates and works with these other, what we call supporting evidence-based practices. So it's not like, oh, we're doing CTI. Does that mean we're not doing harm reduction, or we're not doing housing first? These things all blend together very nicely. CTI is a harm reduction approach. It's also a very housing first approach. Person-centered planning, family psychoeducation, things you might be doing, because this is definitely about connecting people to friends and family of choice, not just family of, by blood. Motivational interviewing works great with CTI, and we'll be sharing things that really infuse the practice of using MI in this stages of change. But it does assume, and we're not going to do in this session, sort of basic how to engage people. And we'll make some comments about that, how to assess and how to counsel people, so that, we know you guys are bringing skills to the table, but it's really, how do those skills get applied in specifically in relation to critical time intervention? Again, remember, if I'm trying not to talk too New York fast, but if you have a question or a comment, put it in the chat. Andrea will pay attention when I'm talking, and I'll try and pay attention when she's talking. So I kind of already mentioned this transitions issue. Maybe we should put a poll in here for the next time of how many of you have been through a major life transition in the last year, like getting a new job, like getting married, like getting divorced, like getting a new house, like, your kid going to college. How many people just maybe I get a show of hands on that? Okay. Seeing a few of you. Okay. Quite a few of you, more and more. Well, if you're in that boat, you know what I'm going to say on this slide, because you've been through a transition. Thank you for the participating. It can be a new start. It can be an opportunity for good changes, but it's not all, roses. When you get make a new transition, you always have some loss involved. So even if you're leaving homelessness, you might be losing your friends that you lived in the shelter with. You might be losing your routine of how you managed when you were homeless, right? If you are, have a new job, same thing. You might be missing your colleagues. You might be missing the location where you used to work. But it's important to recognize that in transition, that there is some loss, even if it's a good outcome, like getting a new house. People are losing some things, and we want to acknowledge that, and we'll talk more about that, so that we're prepared to provide additional support. Because I think when it can be seen that getting a house is a great thing, which it is, but if we don't help people, support people through the difficult parts, it's harder for them to make that transition. And transitions are the most stressful times in people's lives, because they involve uncertainty. So you don't know, what are my new colleagues going to be like? What are my new neighbors going to be like? How am I going to do paying these bills? Am I going to actually make it? Is this job, going to work out? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's a time of increased stress, even in a positive situation. So it's important to remember that. We might see increases in symptoms or behaviors that people have that they have improved. Like maybe they have been drinking and drugging less, and they move into their house and they have a big old party that lasts for 3 days. That never happens to any of you guys? Or someone who is a collector and maybe collected a lot of stuff, but they were keeping it in check, but now there's no path to the door because they have so much stuff, and the path to the door, right? We might see some increase in some of those symptoms sometimes. So that also, we would think maybe people should be happy, they're in new housing, settle down. We might see some real, some increase because of the anxiety, because of the stress. People need a new schedule. Usually when you're homeless, you have a routine you have to follow, depending on what the system is that you're in. If you're in a hotel, if you're in a shelter, if you're on your car, which I know you have a lot of people in cars in California. And, you have to live that way. And when you're homeless, and when you have a house, it's different. And, People need to create a new routine for themselves. Things they spend a lot of time doing when they were homeless might be much easier. Like you used to have to go and sign up for a shower or go to the soup kitchen and wait online for lunch. But now you can get lunch in a minute in the microwave, right? So what do you do with all that time? And that's one of the things we see for people is sometimes they have a lot of time on their hands. They don't really know what to do besides go to the day center or those kinds of things. And so we have to help people kind of figure out how to fill their time and how to manage in their homes too. The transition brings up fears of failure. Everybody you're working with has been homeless. That's why they're in your program. And when you get a house, again, once you've been homeless, you think about how you became homeless before. If you don't, it's rare for people to not think about that and be worried that they might fail again, that the same thing might happen, that they may lose that job and fall behind on their rent and lose their housing. So we also know, it's again, in the stress, that fear of failing. And we might want to reach for some of these things directly with people as we're working with them in terms of stabilizing in their housing, because if they can verbalize it and we can talk about how do we prevent this from happening again. So the last time you lost your job, you didn't have any savings, we didn't have any mediation services, but this time around you have support. We have this, we'll put this in place. So we want to address these things that people need during the transition. And CTI is all about helping people pre and post transition. One question I think we might have for you guys, if some of you could pop it in the chat, is when do you start working with people? Is it just when they're starting to move into the housing, or are you able to work with them while they're homeless at all? How does that work for you guys? Anybody want to give us a little input on that? I think I see some people maybe typing. Or speak up. You can just unmute yourself.
During the
initial intake. Thank you, Teresa. Okay. So that may be something that is something you want to think more about as we talk to you about this practice. Is there a way for you to start connecting with people earlier, or with their shelter or their outreach workers earlier at the first engagement with the client, says Ms. D. Scruggs. And that's when they're starting rapid rehousing, when they're leaving their homeless place. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
So we'll talk more about that bridge, because it's a really important point of knowing kind of what's going on for people while they're homeless, so that it can help inform your practice once you start working with them. Again, we'll get all into this in a lot more detail later. So just, this is 2 slides that boil CTI down to just some of the key bullet points. And as I said, we will go deeper. The focus of the practice is on housing stability and achieving life goals. So it's about connecting, maintaining your housing, being successful in your housing to what you want. If that's maybe getting reunited with your children, maybe that's your goal is to get a job, maybe your goal is to get a car. We want to always be helping people make the connection between how having a stable home is going to support them in achieving their goal. So that's the person-centered recovery orientation. There are phases in CTI. The pre-CTI phase is planning and preparing for the transition. This is a really important phase, and this is what I was kind of talking about in the slide before. Before people move into housing and they meet you at intake, they're getting ready for that. They have to fill out paperwork, they have to get documents, they might be starting work and things like that. So that pre-CTI phase is a lot going on, and it's important phase to get extra support in. So we'll talk more about that. Then once people move into housing, there are 3 phases after pre-CTI. There's really 4 phases, but only 3 have numbers. And there's phase 1, which is transition to the community. That's the first 2 to 3 months in housing. Phase 2, which is tryout. That's the first 2 to 3 months. And then phase 3 is transfer of care or termination. In your case, you're probably going to close the case at some point. And that would be another 2 to 3 months. When this first got started with rapid rehousing, CTI and rapid rehousing, everybody was really trying to do a 6-month intervention, right? Keep the rapid rehousing, 6 months of assistance and 6 months of case management. And what we've seen during COVID is that people needed longer terms of assistance. Things were a lot harder around employment and other things. So some places their rapid rehousing expanded and it became longer. You can still do CTI as a time limited intervention. Say you do work with somebody for 12 months. After the CTI intervention is over, because we want clients to feel progress, you would just move them to what we would call care as usual, whatever your normal rapid rehousing case management looks like. Because CTI, we do want people to feel like they've completed a program. And we'll get into in later discussions, what's the difference of all these phases? Because at each phase, there's different things you would focus on as a worker in terms of helping the person stabilize. First, of course, phase like getting ready in the neighborhood, phase 2, connecting, seeing how those resources are working out. And then phase 3 is the transfer of care. I just see something popped in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, I see that. And everybody can see it. Every client is different for Erin Lyons. Some we engage at time they're losing their housing, some already homeless, and some who have become housed. Okay.
And then Nicholas said, as a housing navigator, he works with the clients while they are homeless during the housing process and after being housed.
Okay, great. That's great. Nicholas, thank you. Then you would be able to do the pre-CTI work and the post-housing CTI phases. As I said, it's time limited, but you may continue your work, but the intervention itself is time limited and it's phased. And that's so, as I said, clients have a sense of success. They've completed a program. The intervention is really meant to step down to care as usual. And that may be, like I said, your monthly case management visits that continue during the course of the time they get financial assistance. The other things that are core in CTI, it's a very limited focus. So when you do a service plan, which we really call a housing stabilization plan, and we'll talk more about that too, there's no more than 3 goals. And there could just be one goal related to housing. Usually we're looking for one goal around their housing, and maybe that's to move out, or maybe that's to get a better place, but we are looking for a housing goal and then maybe 1 or 2 others. It's good to be ambitious, but most people can't really work on more than 3 goals at one time. When we're in person, we usually ask for a show of hands of how many people are working on personal goals right now. And
Yeah.
I'm sure many of you are. And then we ask how many of you are working on more than 3. And that usually becomes a much smaller subset, because although there's always one person who's working on 10 things, we all know that person in our life who's got 10 goals and achieving them all. But for most human beings, that is really not doable. So CTI really focuses on, let's keep the focus narrow. Let's keep the focus on housing and personal goals and keep the goals to a minimum. The assessment domains are also recommended. There's recommended assessment domains in CTI that are based on the things that we know are going to make people successful in the community. What are the protective factors? What are the risk factors that we want to be aware of? Obviously the people we're working with, there's a million things we could learn about them, but how do we have a focused assessment that gets us the information we need to help them without being overly intrusive, and that's also focused? Again, you guys are busy. We don't need to be assessing things we're not going to do anything with. And clients certainly don't need any more assessment than they already have going on. Everything is about focused on helping people be stably housed, meeting their obligations as a tenant, being successful in the community, following community norms, having basic needs met. And I think this is where people really struggle if they have no income. I don't know how much this comes up in rapid rehousing, but if people don't have any money, it really threatens housing stability. So helping people have enough resources to meet their basic needs, and then also helping people get some relief from things that disturb them and bother them, right? So that you're feeling better. If they're sick, it's hard to really focus on getting a job or working on their relationship with your kid, or, keeping your apartment up. So helping people get relief. And that's I always use that as an engagement tool. How can we help people feel a little bit better? And then finally, the last key thing is that, as I mentioned before, it's all about building networks of support and linkages, both formal and informal. So friends and family, clubs, recreation, things for the kids. I know you're working with a lot of families. Parents need a break and the kids need something to do with all that energy, right? So connecting people up to, and as well as people may need therapy, or they may need psychiatric medications, or they may need treatment, or they may need substance abuse treatment. We're talking about the full range of supports, and we'll again go deeper on that. But the big one we want to highlight is the natural supports, and really helping people connect with, somebody to call when you're happy, somebody to call when you're sad, not having the case manager be the nexus of people's lives. Andrea and I used to joke in the field, we were often the emergency contact. We were a lot of single, unaffiliated people. They had no emergency contacts. So a simple goal for us as workers was to help find a person who cared enough about that person to be an emergency contact, right? Just the little things. And then people start to build their network, and they keep building their networks. All right, I think, I see somebody just put something in the chat.
Yes, it comes up, and that's one of 3 goals for some. I'm assuming this is, LaShandria, I think this was about the children, right? Yeah. I
You're
can launch.
muted, LaShandria. She's muted.
You're muted.
It was actually for finding a job as being
Great.
one of the 3 goals.
Yep. Increasing income is, very frequently one of the 3 things, and particularly in rapid rehousing.
Yeah,
Good one.
and especially if you have kids.
Yeah. Because kids are expensive. We know
They're
that.
a money pit, right? Children, we love them, but they're a money pit. All right, I will launch the polls. I forgot. Thank you, Andrea, for reminding me.
I can launch it. I got
It's
it.
done.
Okay.
It's done. All right, so here's a poll. This is about your CTI experience. I didn't make my normal point, but I'll make it now. CTI was this, and I'll make it again later, was discovered by watching good case managers do housing-based work, and then they researched it and proved it effective. It wasn't grown in a laboratory in a petri dish. So many of you are already doing aspects of CTI. So are you already implementing CTI in your work? Have you ever been to a CTI training before? So I'll give you a couple more minutes. I know some of you may be pulled away. We get that. I know that people need you. Your staff needs you. Your colleagues need you. Your clients need you.
Great.
But we'll give you another couple of, we've got 19 of 29 at this point. So I'll just give it another 5 seconds, get a full minute for people to plug on. And I know some of you might be on the phone, so I don't know how polls work on the phone. I've never been on the other side of that. So, okay, I'm gonna, we've got 20 out of 29, 19 out of 29.
Yeah.
So I'll share that. Are you already implementing elements of CTI in your work? Yes or no? And 80%, I'm just gonna round it right up there, of you are, which is great. It should feel familiar. It should feel like the things you've been focusing on in good housing focused work. You guys out in California have been really very much at the forefront of this approach, these approaches. And I know some of your organizations have probably even had training in it. So when that comes to our second question, have you ever been to a CTI training before? 42% of you have, and 53% haven't. Okay, so that's good for us to know too, in terms of the mix in the crowd. And we'll talk more again later, I think, about other ways that you have, what the things you actually have implemented. Okay, so now Andrea is going to pick up.
Yep. So I'm going to talk a little bit about case management and CTI. And one of the most important things we know from really studying this transition from the practice is that it requires more intensive services at the beginning, in the first 1 to 3 months especially, or 1 to 2 months especially, so that people have to have adequate time, and people also have to have resources. And that includes connections in the community and connections with landlords. That you need to have services that are sustainable, that can sustain people outside of the rapid rehousing or when they finish rapid rehousing, because we're really wrapping people up with a network of care that will sustain them in the future. It's also really important to have landlords we can work with who provide that structure of the lease and provide concrete expectations, because a big part of this in rapid rehousing is we're teaching people tenancy skills. And the way to do that is to make the system clear, and that the landlords really contribute to by enforcing equitably and consistently the lease. And then the other thing is that CTI is very goal-based, particularly in rapid rehousing. So it's not crisis or problem oriented. It's really about helping people get a step up, maintain their base in the community, which is housing, and be thinking about what housing in the future. So that's really important. Okay, let's go to the next one. Part of this is, I mentioned, the landlords, and so that we need a structure. And an important thing to remember is homeless people survive by figuring out systems and figuring out how systems work for them. So we need to give people a system to work, and it's pretty well defined with housing, and it's defined by the lease. So that, and those don't change, no matter if they're in rapid rehousing or if they're on their own with their own landlord. So we want to make sure that people understand the expectations of the lease and that these apply to everyone. The other thing is that we want to make it clear, and we want to make it clear by clear enforcement, right? We're not going to threaten everybody with eviction, but what we're going to tell them is that's a lease violation. This is the possible things that happen with a lease violation. Let's talk about how you can address this so that you're not in violation of your lease. And that being able to follow a lease is a key skill and helps people get other housing as they move on. The other thing about lease violations is when somebody gets in trouble with a landlord, they're more likely to go to the services. And sometimes people feel like, what do I need services? I have what I want. I have housing. But maintaining housing becomes much more real when people are having problems with the lease, and they'll often seek out supportive services, which is really helpful. And that in order to do this, we're going to really focus on behaviors that interfere with their functioning as a tenant and help them change those behaviors. We also want people to be a member of the community and respect community norms and connect housing stability to personal goals, both long-term goals and short-term goals. So we want to talk to them about how being able to maintain a place to stay, for instance, will help them maintain their children in the community if they're recently reunited or something. Or that, what does stable housing have to do with a job? It's a lot easier to maintain a job when you have a place to stay and that you can count on. So we're going to connect those goals all the time. And finally, we're going to connect the goals for having a good leasing history to being able to have more choice in housing, which is something that people really care about. Okay. So collaboration is a key element of CTI, and it goes with both the people we serve, the families and the individuals, and also the resources that we depend on, and also the landlords. So we want to collaborate with everyone. And then important to do that is to be clear about what the goals are of your service so that people understand that and that they're bought into those, and those reflect their own personal goals. So once again, it's bringing those personal goals together with housing stability. It's a commitment to listen to people, what they want long-term, how we can help them reach it, and developing a path. That doesn't mean if somebody says, I want a house with a pool, that might be their long-term goal. That doesn't mean that's going to happen within rapid rehousing, but we can certainly set them on the path where in the future that might be possible, and we want to talk to them about that. The other thing is to be clear about what the staff does, right? I don't know about you guys, but when I started working with people in housing, they really had no idea what to do with me and would do stuff like, can I have a bus ticket, right? Can I have, right? Do you guys hear that? Yeah, I mean, I think that this starts in the beginning. Suzanne mentioned pre-CTI to create the expectations of how to work with a worker. And a lot of that is going to come in the warm handoff from that we're going to talk about in a little bit from their previous program, and what the worker's role is. We want to start that in the beginning, and we want to reinforce that on a regular basis. People aren't trying to insult you when they ask for bus tickets. They really don't have any idea what to ask you for. And then, how can I help you? Maybe a bus ticket. So let's help them. Well, how about we work on that SSI that you started in the shelter? Or how about we work on, and that goes to increasing income, and that goes to more housing stability. We want to make those connections. And then we want to do some cross-team collaborations and warm handoffs. So we want to not only work with the programs they've been in before, whether it be outreach or whether it be shelter. We also want to work with the programs that they're involved in here, and also their connections in the community to further support this person to stabilize in housing and stay there. Okay. So it's important to think about what we're going for and what our goals are. And one of our goals, and we mentioned that, is to maintain a base in the community, right? Suzanne mentioned some research, and we know that if people can maintain a base in the community and they get assistance in the transition, it has an effect on their mental health, on their substance abuse, but also on their not using emergency accommodations, those sorts of things. So we really want to focus on people maintaining a base in the community. We also want to focus on increasing income. So as LaShondra said, we really want to talk about, oftentimes people's goal is a job. People need income in order to make it in the community. And that rapid rehousing means that people are going to have to sustain the housing with pretty limited supports in the future. So increasing income will be really important towards that. And it's both benefits income and employment income. As Suzanne mentioned, we want to help people develop that network of supports. It's going to sustain them in the future, so that they have to be reliable, they have to be consistent, and they have to be high quality. And then the other thing we're trying to do is have people have less disruptions in their life. And that might mean emergency room visits, jail, places where they're taken out of their normal life. We want those less emergency interventions. And what that goes to is less crisis in people's lives. We want to teach people critical thinking skills, have them have options, and less crisis. Crisis as a worker can mess up your whole week. Right? That's the other part of this. And then we want some structure and purpose and valued roles in people's lives. Roles give people structure in their lives. It gives them an idea about how to adapt their schedule. It creates expectations. It creates forward thinking. So we want to help people have something to look forward to every week. We want to have people do some planning, do some structuring, and also redefine their roles as a more active participant. Oftentimes people who are homeless define that they don't have a lot of control over their lives. In housing, you do have control. There's a structure, and you have control about whether you follow that structure or not, whether this is working for you. We want to really engage people in thinking about what their role is and what that means to them and how that affects their day-to-day life. Because it is a big problem. Suzanne talked about this, is people really don't have anything to do. And you know what? If people don't have anything to do, it's intolerable for people for long periods of time, and they revert back to old patterns. That's why we want to focus on these new roles, their new structure, and their new purpose, particularly the role of a tenant.
I just want to say a word before, if you want to launch Paul, you can, or I'm ready, but just a word about, I'm not sure if in your rapid rehousing, you are housing long-term homeless people, but that for people who have been homeless for a long time, that role of being a homeless person is their primary role, right? True. And it's so defining for folks. Not everybody you're working with, I'm sure, has been homeless as long and really taken that on, but that's a big shift that for people to make. And I'm sure you've seen people who still go to the day center or hang out at the shelter, or maybe even go back to the shelter to sleep. I've met a woman at a shelter recently, and she had a rapid rehousing unit, but she was sleeping in the shelter because that was her comfort. Right. But that transition and role is so important to find something new. And that formerly homeless isn't a role, right? That's not a role. No. I'm a formerly homeless person. No. So, what is the person's new role? And Andrea always talks about this a lot, about, do they want to be an artist? Do they want to be a fisherman? Do they want to be an athlete? Do they want to be a mom again, or a dad again? Or what is it? An advocate, maybe. But thinking about that in particular, I think that that's really a challenge, and why we have some struggles when we're working with long-term homeless people in rapid rehousing. So want to pay attention to helping them identify something that's important.
Absolutely. So we have a comment. There are stages in one's homelessness, but transition and support is essential to their success and sustainability. Absolutely. Thank you, JC. That's really a core component of CTI. I'm going to launch a poll. It's about implementation, and we had talked about that you're already implementing some aspects of CTI, so this sort of breaks them down. Tenant goal, recovery focus, focused assessment, focused service, housing stabilization plans. Remember, we talked about limited goals. Oops, thank you. Learning about housing and homeless history, connecting to a network of care, which we just talked about, developing individual resource lists, which we're going to cover, teaching tenants self-advocacy skills, which is really important, teaching them how to deal with these networks of care, coordinating with landlords, helping people develop structure and purpose in their lives, and finally, helping people address the issues that result in lease violations. So we're getting a pretty good response.
Yep. So for those of you who may have to be looking at something else, there's a poll up, and we'd love to hear what you're already doing in the field, just because we want to reinforce that and second it and support those efforts, because those are all really CTI efforts. Give it another maybe 10 seconds, I guess, Andrea. It's a long one. There's a lot to read there. It's a long question. Sorry about that. But I did get a note from someone who may wish to remain anonymous that the polls do work on the phone. So I'm glad to hear that. So
good.
Thank you. Thanks for that information. Okay.
Yeah, I think we got about 21. Yep.
Yep, we're going to stop. We've got 21 out of 29, and 29 includes me, Andrea, me and you too.
Yep.
So the big winners here, what are the big winners? Let me scan through it. Okay, we've got a couple of 86%. Tenant goal and a recovery focus in the interventions. Excellent. Focus serving and service or housing stabilization plans. Excellent, because that's really so important. Coordinating with landlords and property managers is another high number there. But there's a lot of these are you're doing, which is great. It looks like more, almost except for focused assessment, almost everything is 2/3 or more. Learning about homeless history is a little lower. Is kind of the next tier, helping people develop structure and purpose in their lives. So you can see it. What's the other? That's a high one. Helping people address lease violations. That's another really high one that more than 3/4 of you are doing. So you're already doing a lot of parts of CTI. That's not to say that there's nothing to gain from this training. So don't want you to feel like you're wasting your time. Part of what CTI is about, organizing and structuring your work and being able to talk about it and talk about what CTI informed, and being intentional both with your staff as well as the clients about the practice. And we'll talk more about that, but we recommend letting clients know, or participants or tenants, whatever you call them, that we are using CTI as an intervention with them. So we'll talk more about that.
Yep. Okay, we're going to do a breakout.
Yep.
So you've already introduced yourselves, so that's a good thing. And the questions for the breakout are in the chat box, but you're going to talk a little bit about what are your reactions to the CTI model so far as you understand it. But I understand that a lot of people have taken the class before, and sort of what's your previous experience? What's your current experience?
Oh, you froze. I will pick up. And elements of CTI that you're already implementing at your work. So this is just a chance for you to share. Andrea, you froze, so I picked up. Just a chance for you to share. So I'm going to go back to the rooms. And how long are we giving people, Andrea, on this?
Probably about maybe 10 minutes.
Yep. and we will give you a warning when it's
Yep.
time to come back. Okay, so you have to actively join if you want to join a breakout room.
Yep. Everybody see it? There we go.
And I am going to pause recording.
Shared with the team, Suzanne and Andrea. I love your energy. I'm an East Coast fan, so I just love the
That's
energy
very
in this
nice.
training thus far. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Well,
JC.
thank
That's
you.
nice to hear.
Sure
That's
is.
nice to hear.
Newark,
New
New
York.
Jersey it is for me.
You
Newark,
go.
another Teresa's Newark too. Okay,
Yeah.
all the East Coasters always come out to us when they meet us. So, and the East Coast and the West Coast are different, but not all that different. But and there's a lot of transplants both ways. Okay, so Andrea's going to debrief this. I
Yep.
forgot that. Yep.
So, any reflections on the conversation? Are there things that you like? Are there things you worry about? How does it go with your last experience with CTI? A lot of people have done that. LaShondria, it's hard to hear.
I'm not talking. I think that's Miss Darlene you hear.
Okay.
I'm gonna mute myself. You can hear from the other room. Sorry.
Okay. Anybody have any reflections on what do you think? Was this a surprise to you? Sort of the CTI, the way that we laid it out? Does it sound really familiar?
To me,
Yes.
it sounded really familiar, but there's a lot of things you touched on that I haven't thought about in a while, and it's very informative. I'm enjoying it. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Letitia.
Yeah, for me, it also lets me know some of the questions that I want to ask when I'm with the clients, things that I probably wouldn't have thought of on my own. So just having a CTI model is really good for a person to have when they're doing their engagements with clients.
That's great. We feel the same way. It really helps, and the structure helps. The other thing is, even stuff that you do fairly regularly, it makes it more consistent and consistent across the board. So that's really helpful to everybody. That's great.
So I was saying in my group, so I took this training last year
Yep.
in the agency that I just previously worked with, and the model works. I've had the opportunity to implement it in my last role, and from the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so it's been wonderful to be able to transfer it to the new role I'm in, because I have different stages of clients. I have clients that are homeless looking for housing. I have clients who are at imminent risk of being homeless again, and I have clients who are housed. And so being able to go from the beginning, middle, and end and see how well this model works, I'm excited to be able to now bring it to my new agency to implement it with my clients. So I'm excited. I've seen it firsthand, so I know it works. So
That's a wonderful thing.
Great.
Thank you, Jackie. That's
thank
a
you
great
too
thing.
for the
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I also wanted to share too that having lived experience which is very important too. And this was actually, the model works because it was implemented. And having the lived experience in previous homelessness years ago, and seeing the talking points for each bullet point, it does work. It worked on me. And homelessness looks like you and I. It doesn't just look like those folks in the encampment. So the CTI model is very, and the point that Jackie brought up about the different stages on where folks are at. Some need a higher level of care. Some need that one-time, service, the touch point. So it really just all depends on where that person's stage is in their life. But I will say, as having lived experience and the CTI model was actually used on myself from my case manager that supported me in my homelessness. It works. And the main point that I want to bring up, especially in the aftercare to transition to self-sufficiency and that sustainability, to have a care coordinator or a case manager, just even follow up just to say, hey, how's it going? I know that you're successfully housed, but I'm just checking in to make sure that you have the community connects and the resources that you need before we exit you out is a very, very essential part in CTI. So I just wanted to share that the 10 bullet points that you brought up in that poll touched on all phases in the critical time intervention.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, JC. That's very helpful. And yeah, it is. And it's also collaborative. I think that which is our natural instinct. And I think that that's really helpful. And it really reflects a lot of the peer models. This is a collaboration, right?
Yes, it's a partnership.
Absolutely. It's a partnership. Better. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Oh, that's great. Thank you guys for sharing that.
Thank you.
So wonderful to hear, and really glad to have folks in the room who have, seen this work from both sides as a practitioner and as a participant. So hopefully that'll just continue.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pick up for a couple of slides. This slide has too much on it, but let me start there. But originally, this was research, and I mentioned this earlier, that this was not developed in a petri dish or in a lab, but it was studied at Columbia University by looking at workers who were doing housing-focused case management with people in a very large shelter in New York City, Fort Washington Armory. For those of you who know, the East Coast was an 800-bed men's shelter. And they observed them doing this intensive intervention, helping people get ready for housing, and then supporting them in the first CTI model is a 9-month model. And they researched what they did, and they, distilled the key elements, and that's how the model was built. And then they researched it. So, and since the initial research, which was in the 1990s, so it's from the 20th century, it's been around, but only applied to rapid rehousing in the last like 5 to 7 years. But as I said earlier, it's been used with people coming out of prison. A lot of veterans programs use critical time intervention. It's been used with young adults and all sorts of different populations. There's some outcomes here that you can read later. This is from a veteran study. But without even getting into treatment, people had improvements in their alcohol use and their psychiatric experience of problems. So that even without going into treatment, just having the CTI intervention necessarily improved also their housing outcomes. So that's just one piece of research here. How is CTI different? So we're talking a lot about, you're doing a lot of things about CTI. So what is unique about CTI? What is different from other interventions? Well, case management or service coordination can be ongoing. It can really be all over the map because our clients have a lot of needs, but that it's very structured and it's time limited, right? So that it is an intervention that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We've mentioned the goal focus, not symptom-based. We know that sometimes people have to bill for Medicaid or Medi-Cal in your state, as it's called, and then they have to have problems that they're working on, that they're fixing. And we know that sometimes that's a requirement of the funders, but the core of the work in CTI is really to be goal focused with people, helping them see their future and what's next. And when you're homeless, life is day to day. You're just getting through the day. And the future might be just a week from now, a month from now. It may not be a 5-year plan, but any forward-looking connection to the future and to a new goal is what we're really looking for in CTI. It's all about the transition and helping people with all those challenges I talked about at the beginning of the transition, the good and the bad, the mourning the loss of the friends, the shelter worker, the, having less money, because usually when you're homeless, you don't have to spend your money on rent, but then you have to spend your money on rent when you're in housing. So people have to deal with that stress, or kids in a new school system, all those things. We talked about the community connections. It is very, 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 very much about helping you not be the nexus of people's lives, but help bringing in other services and supports that help people stabilize. It's a community-based service or a home-based service. So I know everything's different with COVID. So a lot of people have been doing service on video chat, by phone. Some people don't want you to visit them in their homes. Some of you are not going into people's homes. It varies. But it is meant to have some, it's not necessarily an office-based service, so that if people want to meet for coffee in the park, and that's the comfortable way for them to meet with you, that you can do that. Right, that you can meet out in the community. Also, when we talk about community resources, helping people get to these new resources is a key part of CTI. So in CTI, if you refer someone, say, to a new, let's say healthcare provider, let's just say, On the first visit to that healthcare provider in CTI, you would accompany that person to that visit and support them through it. And the reason is not because they can't do it themselves. The reason is because you want to assess, how did they do when they had to interact with that new resource? What skills did they bring there? What things were challenging for them? So that as you start to connect them up with other resources, you know what level of support people need to make those resources work. So if somebody got to the healthcare provider and they said they had to wait 15 minutes and they were like, okay, great, I'm going to read my phone. That's one response. If they started getting really agitated with the receptionist, thinking that might move them up in line, usually works the reverse, right? When you get agitated with the receptionist, that you go down lower in the line. But we want to know that too, because then we can help people develop the skills and talk to them about what you get with sugar versus vinegar, right? We all know that expression that you use. You want to get up in the line, you compliment the receptionist on her baby's pictures that's on her desk, right? I see some of you laughing, you know what I mean, right? That's how you get things. And so we want to assess, how do people negotiate for resources? It's really a key thing. And when we go to the assessment form, you'll see it's a part of assessing is, are people able to access help and secure it for themselves? And so we are going out in the community with people to assess that, and then also to provide support and debrief it and help them learn how to better manage those resources, and also what kind of supports they're going to need. In CTI, we didn't really highlight this much, but when we go deeper in each phase, you'll see there's an expectation that the frequency of visits and contacts gets to be less over time, and staff step back. So from the beginning phase, where you might meet with people weekly, in phase two, in phase one, when they first moved into housing, you might meet with people weekly. In phase two, you would maybe go to bi-weekly with people. And phase three might be once a month with people. So that the goal is to step back. Now, if somebody's going into crisis or they need a lot of stuff, we're going to do what we need to do. You can step it back up, even though you're, say, in phase two, the person's been housed for 4 months and they go into have a major problem and they need assistance every week. You're not going to move them back in the phases to stay in phase two, but you're going to up your intervention to phase one, right? Part of this is to keep it motivational for clients. So we don't want to send anybody back to phase one. You don't get thrown back like in school, left back or whatever it is. And then we'll talk also about CTI has recommendations for forms and tools to help the documentation support you in your work. So for example, the CTI service plan / housing stabilization plan only has room for 3 goals. So you can't have 6 goals, in the service plan. And we'll get through that a little bit more later. CTI also requires supports from your organization, buy-in from different levels. I know some of you are situated at different levels in your organizations right now. To really implement it well, you really do want buy-in at all levels. This is a great fundraising. You want to let your EDs know about it too, because it's an evidence-based practice. A lot of you have fundraising departments. That would be something they'd want to blow their horn about, toot the horn, and say you're doing this evidence-based practice. But you need to hire the right people. So HR, organizational, you might have to revise job descriptions. So that's where you might need HR's involvement. There's a lot of support. So CTI is not just one really good worker doing great work with with 10 households or 15 households, but involved in the practice is supervision, team meetings, case reviews and case conferences, as well as clinical consultation. So you might have somebody who things are going on with, and you really don't understand what's going on with this person. You may need to involve a psychiatrist or psychologist. Maybe you're seeing some emerging PTSD with some of your families that you're working with, which is not uncommon. You might need to have some clinical consultation. So that's the reason organizational supports are needed, because you want to have supervision, weekly team supervision, and we'll get into this in later sessions, and have the support to do the work the right way. There's also in CTI workload management, because people in different phases, since you're expected to see them different amount of time, different frequencies, that caseloads are weighted. So when people are in phase one, they count as double because it's such an intensive intervention. And then when people are on phase two, they count as 1. And then when people are in phase 2, 3, because again, you're stepping back, you should be going to and except for in case of crisis, lesser frequency of contact, they count as a half. So you do your caseload as you're adjusting that and looking at, if I have all new people in phase 1 and that's 10, I really have a caseload of 20. So supervisors want to manage the workload. It's generally good to have a mix of people in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but we know you can't always control for that, you know, depending on intake and who has, which staff may have vacancies in their caseload, but do think about that. There's a lot of support for staff, ongoing training and education as you do the work. You need resources. You might be referring a lot to a new mental health clinic, say, or to a new domestic violence provider. So it might make sense for your agency to make a relationship with that domestic violence provider, not just you as an individual worker, but if you know in your rapid rehousing program, we are really needing a lot of counseling, because what we're finding is after people are moving in and they settle down a little bit, you know, stuff is really coming up, or they're batterers, which we see a lot, and they get housing and the batterer comes back and is going to change, right? Going to be the perfect partner. And then usually that doesn't just happen like that, right? And so people may need some assistance managing a batterer who's re-entered their lives. But so you may want to, as an agency, have a relationship set up, maybe through an MOU, or at least having your program directors or, you know, executive director meet with the people who run that DV service, introduce your service, and say, well, you'll be hearing a lot from my staff. Can we set up some protocols maybe to make this easier, that kind of thing. So you may need the organization support in creating new relationships. And then also there's policies and procedures, and we talk about this later, but you need to have good policies and procedures for home visits, because CTI, you do want to visit people in their home at least sometimes. And even if it's just briefly, because you want to get a sense of what's going on in that unit in case it may be putting their tenancy at risk, right? So we're not nosy. We're not spying on you. We're not judging you, but that's our role, right? So we're reinforcing our role is to help you maintain this housing. And part of that is seeing how it's going in the housing so we can intervene, right? So we explain that to people. Even still, some people may not want us in their homes very often. So we always want to moderate that, but also confidentiality. Since we're dealing with a lot of community resources, you want to make sure you're very clear about confidentiality policies in your organization and following those. And sometimes the confidentiality policies may need to be adjusted. And then finally, you want to take a look at implementing CTI, but you want to have a process to evolve the program. If you're finding out certain things, you're learning things, you need a new specialist on your team for employment because you're really having a lot of trouble with the employment piece. Well, you want to be able to have a process to adjust your teams. For those of you who are interested, there is a tool that we did put on the attachments, and I think to the appointment today, and I believe Andrea already popped it into the chat. I'm not going to take time right now to move over there, because we can move over there when we do our implementation session number 5, because I want to make sure we get time on assessment and give you time for the breakout group. But it's a tool for programs to assess, not for you as a worker to assess, but for a program to assess how it's doing on implementing CTI practice. And there's 40 domains. It's a self-scoring tool. There's, it's up to you to do it. You score yourself 1 to 5 on each domain. And it reviews, as you can see on the right, the kind of key components of CTI. And what we recommend is, if you are implementing CTI and you're a program manager, or you want to talk to your program manager about it, look at the self-assessment, do it at the beginning of your implementation, then maybe do it every 6 months or so to see how you're doing. And this is really only if you're interested. It's not a requirement. I want to just make sure we say that. None of the things we share with you are requirements. They're recommendations for something you can use. But I know some of you are in the role of being a program manager or director and may want to do some kind of self-assessment.
Helpful.
I see something popped in the chat. So before I turn it over to Andrea,
It was
Andrea
just, I put the,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Andrea.
So let's talk a little bit about housing stabilization, and where the base that people have in the community. is that one of the key things about housing is it creates expectations, it creates roles. Suzanne mentioned this, and it creates expectations of people that helps people organize, right? People have to have a system they're working. It also provides a vehicle for that role, that tenant role. And as Suzanne mentioned, a lot of times people feel like when they're homeless that everything is happening to them, but when they're in housing, they have a little more control and they're clearer expectations. And so we want to help people adjust to that tenant role. We also want to, in order to do that, we have to have an assertive landlord who will be clear and flag lease violations and give people a warning, but also give them an opportunity to correct those violations. We don't expect people to be great tenants the minute they move into rapid rehousing. How could they be, right? Because a lot of times they don't have that history. They may have lived with a mom and pop landlord. They may not have had a lease in their name. So we want to teach people tenancy skills. And part of that is making obvious the system, which is the lease. It also requires support to maintain their tenancy and to make that transition. And transitions are tough. Suzanne talked a lot about that, but the other thing is people often drop out during transitions. So they oftentimes need some real support in order to do that. And then the other thing about housing is it provides an early warning system. If somebody's not paying their rent, there's something wrong. Could be they lost their job, could be they're drinking, could be they just don't want to pay their rent, but there's something wrong. So it's the functional criteria that gives us a clue that there might be something wrong. And it's not always the same thing. In fact, it's rarely the same thing, but it's something to investigate. So it gives us an early warning system of problems. So we want to launch a poll about people's experience as leaseholders. And what this tells us is sort of how much tenancy education that they've had, how is that helpful to them, and the need to do it. So let's put the poll. I can do it.
I just think the other thing I just want to add is that we want to be checking in with landlords monthly.
That's right.
We'll talk about this again, but we like to repeat ourselves. No, we don't like to repeat ourselves, but we do it just to reinforce key points, which is that we really need to be in contact with those landlords, and we need landlords to give us an early warning sign and, you know, give us a heads up.
So you guys do have housing navigators that are checking in with landlords as well. And that communication between the worker and the housing navigator, or when the worker takes over that role, is going to be really important.
So the poll is, in case not everybody can see their screen, is what percentage of your clients have held leases in their own name prior to their current living situation, which is in your rapid rehousing program. So we'll give it a few more seconds here. We have 13 of you guys. And this number's coming up slowly. Okay, we'll give it another 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Okay, so this is not uncommon that you're working with a lot of people who really haven't been leaseholders before. So you can see that really it's only about 18 or 20% of you are working with people, the majority of whom have had leases before. A lot of your team, you are working with half or less of your folks having had leases in their own name. It's helpful to know, it's helpful to think about. And as you're assessing, and we'll talk about housing and homeless history in a minute, as you're assessing that, because that's a really key thing. There's no class in high school on following lease. What's in a lease, right? There's no class. And some of us, as on my first job, I had never had a lease. I had a handshake with my landlord. That was my lease. So how could I teach people about how to follow the lease? Because I had no idea what was in it, because they didn't have a class in high school about it.
Yeah. It's going to be important. Okay. So let's talk about this assessment, and we're going to talk about the housing specific part. Is there is an assessment form that's popped into the chat, and I can pull it up for you all. It's a sample form, right? As we said, it's not a specific, it's CTI informed. So we wrote it to really reflect the CTI. and reflect the CTI assessment domains. So one of the things this does is help us structure our work, right? And we can adapt the forms regularly in use. We're well aware, we work with lots of projects. And if you have 2 assessment forms, people do none, right? So combining them into one assessment form, or, you know, really updating your assessment form with some things that you might like from this form can be really helpful. The recommended frequency is when people come into rapid rehousing and updating the assessment. I'm not talking about doing a whole new assessment all over again, is really updating the assessment every time they switch phases. So it's every 2 months. And that also means you're going to update those plans. So I might just pull up this form.
I can pull it up because I'm sharing, but you want to just introduce that first with that
Sure.
slide, and then I'll pull up the form.
Sure. So the areas that we find that that they found from the research that are most affect housing are the housing and homeless histories and any barriers that they've identified to stability. So it is, you know, past history tends to repeat itself. Somebody's been evicted 3 times because they don't pay their rent. We can assume that's a problem. We can do some eviction prevention right from the beginning. So we want to know what their housing history is, what their homeless history is, because as Suzanne said, people have a different structure, a different purpose, a different, things to do every day when they're homeless, and we've got to adapt some of that. So we want to know something about that. We want to know about their income and their ability to pay bills, pay off debts, that sort of stuff, the whole financial literacy, and their history of employment or training, or is there something they really want to do? We also want to really focus on life skills, but these are through the lens of housing, right? It's not the regular, I don't know, when I'm very old school, as Suzanne said, we're old social workers. I remember those forms about, can people bathe themselves? That's not this. This is about, can people ask for help? Can people pay bills? Those sorts of things. So it's a very specific housing-based life skills. We want to know about their family, their friends, their other supports, the people they rely on, or the people that might not be that great an influence. We want to have a conversation about that too. We want to know about psychiatric and substance abuse issues that might interfere with tenancy and stabilization. And we want to know about their health and medical issues. So we want to look at their history. As I said, history often repeats itself. What's going on currently? What are their strengths? What are their barriers? And what's their motivation to change some of this stuff? So you'll find in this form that we're going to pull up that it asks you what's their motivation in each of those areas. And you want to know what people's priorities are. Look, I've done this for a long time, and I know that, if somebody's very psychotic, I'm worried about that immediately. But if they're psychotic and they got a hurty foot, what are they going to want to focus on? The hurty foot, right? And that, because that's the thing that, as Suzanne said, might give them some relief. We can also use that to build some trust in some medical providers. So maybe they'll take a look at this other stuff, but we want to really know what people's priorities are. So here's the assessment domains as you guys see it. So the first part is just demographics. Then there's a housing and homeless history, right? And it asks basic questions. Have they ever been evicted? They ever been in foster care? And the reason for that, it may seem a little weird, is that's seen as a predictor for homelessness. So we want to know that. And then there's the motivation part and the housing goals part. And there's short and long-term goals as far as housing. And then it goes through this. I'm not going to read this to you, which I'm sure you'll be.
Well, I just want to say something, just a
Yep.
general comment. In each one, it's looking at motivation from the stages of change lens.
Yep.
And I think many of you know it, and we'll be talking about it later, but you want to really say, are they in pre-contemplation, contemplation, in their motivation levels, right? And that's in every section of this form.
Yep.
Okay.
And if we go down a little bit, it goes through income, that sort of thing. If we go down a little bit, also.
Employment, income,
Yeah.
benefits, and entitlements, debts.
Debts, which is really important, right? Also,
If you owe the loan shark, who you gonna pay when the rent
Yeah.
comes due? The loan shark or the landlord? You're gonna pay the
gonna pay the
loan
guy with
shark
a
because the
gun.
loan shark's probably gonna break your legs.
Yeah.
right? Child support, garnished wages, those kind of things, right? Sort of understanding debts, formal and informal, legal
Incarceration
history. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Andrea. Sorry. It's your side.
Incarceration history, if they're on probation or parole, are there felony histories which are going to affect them getting in, but also how they adapt to housing, because that's a big adaptation. That's a big transition from, being in jail to being in housing. Their educational history for both themselves and their children. Then there's some questions about families with independent children. And there's a pretty straightforward physical and behavioral health section, which you'll see. And then these are the independent living skills. So you notice the big question is a history of seeking and using help. That's a really key question in terms of people we're working with, the nature of their social relationships. And then it goes through paying bills, money management, maintaining entitlements. That's very important. How do they maintain a home? Personal care, hygiene, English proficiency, literacy, awareness of needs and knowing when to seek help. Once again, really important. Taking medication, keeping appointments. These are things that are going to affect the people's stability in housing. I also have to say, this is not only self-report. This should also be from your own observations. I mean, I have asked many people, so how you doing with money? Good. Okay, but you've been evicted 4 times for non-payment of rent. All right, let's talk about that, right? So that this is from your own observations and also talking to the person, right? We want people to evaluate it themselves, but we also want to put our evaluation in. Okay.
And this assessment is based on not just what people tell us, but what we've learned through other workers,
absolutely,
what we know from the records. I just want to jump back and point to something though in the
Yep.
behavioral health section, because I think it's really important and reinforces the harm reduction approach. In here is really, we are looking at their diagnoses and what their current treatment is. And so, but how do those issues affect community stability or housing?
Yep.
This is a different form. Housing stability. Does it cause problems with rent, behavior, hoarding, noise, visitors? So we are always looking at that through the lens. So someone may drink, but they don't have they pay their rent, they don't make noise, they go to sleep. So that's very different from they have, parties every night because they like to drink with large groups of people and they make a lot of noise, right? So we want to really be looking in this assessment at that lens of how does this condition or experience affect a person's ability to maintain their housing. Okay, I'm going to go back to the slides, right, Andrea?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Okay.
See, there's a question on the chat, so I'm going to just pick up the chats here.
Yeah.
Due to the various functioning level of different clients, you adjust the time and way you do this assessment with each client. So it's a really good question.
Yeah.
Because this may take multiple conversations with some people can do this all at once. Some people, it's going to take some time to do it. So you are, in terms of how you do it, you want to really be led by that person that you're working with. Can they sit and sustain this level of conversation? Are there things you already know that you don't need to ask them? Because that's the other thing, is sometimes we ask people things we already know. Do we really need to ask them again? So that may affect how long it's going to take to do this assessment. Some people's memories may be better than others in terms of this information. So, it certainly should be tailored to an individual. It might take multiple sessions, especially, when you're talking about some of these more things that you might be more private about. Like, I don't know. The first time I talked to most people, I'm not going to tell them about my mental health diagnosis. Just saying. Right? Not because I necessarily withholding, but just because I don't know you that well. Right? So it may be also affected by your relationship with the person, right? And how well you know them and how you want to take this on. It's a really good point. That's R. Weiss. There was an earlier note in the chat, and I just wanted to acknowledge it about the warm handoff comes in with the clients and the landlord so that the client feels comfortable with coming to the landlord on their own when we step away, right? So that's another reason we talked about accompanying to the new resource, because you're building a bridge so that person can interact more comfortably with the resource. So thank you for that comment.
There was also a comment about the housing navigators at Hope Solutions have a lot of contact with landlords and do an amazing job. So that was a nice shout out,
Nice.
right? So let's talk a little bit about the housing and homeless history and the stuff that you want to know. For the homeless history, you want to know the places they've lived, who they lived with. Basically, for the last 5 years, you want to know if they were the leaseholder. And it sounds like those are questions that you're asking now because people are pretty quick on that poll. You want to know if they lived with other people or if they lived with themselves. What was their responsibility? Were they the tenant? Were they the person who paid maybe some of the food expenses or other expenses? You want to know, what was their role in that household so you know what to work on. It's also, we want to ask people what worked and what didn't. And everybody's had that client that you say, where'd you live? How was that? Oh, it was awful. It was awful. That was the worst place I ever lived. Okay, how about this other place? So yeah, that was the worst place I've ever lived. Oftentimes we want to push people a little bit. Is there anything you liked about this place? Because we can learn a lot from that. We also want to know how satisfied they are with current housing. It's really hard to work on a stabilization plan when people hate their housing. It's not like we're going to move everybody, but we're going to talk about what are some things that we can help them be more comfortable in their housing, what would help, those sorts of things. So we want to know that. We also want to know how they lived with homeless when they were homeless. And as Suzanne said, oftentimes people are thinking about that initial episode. That was often a traumatic experience. So we want to tread a little lightly. It may be something that people don't share with us until they open up a little bit and trust us. But we want to ask them about that. And we want to help them take a look at that and see how that will form their future impressions. We also want to know how long they've been homeless because it makes a big difference. Where did they stay? How did they stay? Did they stay in an encampment? Did they stay in safe parking? Did they stay by themselves? We can know a lot about that, how they react with other people. We also want to know what supports they had and how they managed. We want to know a lot about it. We want to know what they enjoyed when they were homeless so we can replace some of those things. Yeah, I lived in an encampment. It was pretty awful, but you know what? We used to have a card game a couple of nights a week, and that was really fun. Okay, let's talk about maybe getting a card game together here, or how can you get people together for a card game? If it's something you're looking forward to, we want to know about that. Sometimes when people live in an encampment, one person's in charge of sort of securing the food from a food pantry. We want to know if that was their role, if they can help other people with it. We want to know if they were the boss of the encampment, because believe me, if they were the boss of the encampment, they're going to be looking for somebody to boss. And it's either you or it's the other tenants, neither of which often goes over well, right? So we want to know about that stuff and give them opportunities to exercise some leadership that maybe won't get in the way of their housing. So these are the things we want to think about. Okay. So we're going to do a breakout here. And Suzanne just popped it in the chat. Thank you. And we're going to talk about what kind of homeless histories are you seeing? Are people working with happy with their housing? Or are they satisfied with their housing? And are they motivated to maintain it? Do they feel like it's theirs? And how is housing success connected to person's personal goals? So for instance, if their personal goal is to get a house where they can move their family in, if they, if they can maintain this current housing and get a landlord reference, they'll have more choices as far as housing in the future. So that's an example of it. So we want to give people 10 minutes to take this breakout. And the questions are in the chat, which you have access on. Some past partners stated they enjoyed not having to be able to pay rent for their other vices and their freedom as well. Yep. So not having to pay rent is a big advantage. So let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about maybe we can work on increasing their income, or maybe there's some things that we can do about that. So that's what we want to talk about. So we're going to break people up into groups, take 10 minutes. I
Yep, and
am,
we're gonna mix you up again, so you'll see other people. So we've learned that many of you know each other, but not everybody. So hopefully you're getting the rounds when Zoom shuffles you. But if you don't like it, we won't do it anymore. So
right, just
we
tell
keep you,
us.
we could keep you with the same people all day, but we think this makes it a little more interesting. So, but we are very open to feedback. Okay, we're gonna open the rooms and see you
Yeah.
guys back in about 10 minutes.
Yep. Oh, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing. What do people say? Was it different than you expected? What kind of housing homeless histories are you seeing? Housing and homeless histories. No?
Hi, good
Hi.
morning. The homeless history and success that I saw, well, I'm gonna speak on one. The question, the last question of it, it says, how is housing success connected to people's personal goals?
Great, perfect,
I
yeah.
had a client that was stressed. She had a child stressed about going to school, working, and coming to meet the goals and the rules and regulations of the shelter, of the hotel. And before we transitioned, she was happy that I was helping. Our team was helping her find childcare and school for a child. So before she even moved, she found childcare for her child.
That's wonderful.
Able to get her car fixed and still stay in school because they was gonna let her go and finish doing what she needed to do as far as her housing. And the person that she met with the housing, the place where she moved into, we did the warm handoff, meeting the landlord and everything. And the landlord was so enthused about her story that he gave her a recommendation for working with the property that she lives on, and
Wow.
also connecting her to another school for her child, so she don't have to worry about when the child gets out to school, she has to take time off work, go get the child, and then take the child to childcare. He connected her with all
It's
of
a
that.
great example. So
And he was happy for that.
yeah, the network of care, and it also really reflected her long-term goals, which is to live stably in the community with her child and have a job and work and do all those things. So that's a great example.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
people can talk on any of these three questions. I think
good.
one thing we hear a lot is people are not happy in their housing. I'm just going to throw that out to
Yeah.
maybe prompt somebody to say something, but you can say whatever you want. We only have a couple minutes together. We'd love to hear a little bit from you guys for a minute or two, but no pressure. It's of course up to you.
Yep.
I mean, we're in California, so the price of living is a big factor for all of our clients right now, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
shared housing is becoming a valuable option because of price of living.
Yeah.
So it's really just thinking about like outside of the box at all options now.
It's a really good point. And there's a lot of advantages to shared housing, right? Is that even for families, is that the adult has somebody else to talk to, they're not so lonely, and we can talk about that. That's great.
Well, and that may be one of those situations, Felix, I don't know if you were getting at this, but where the person may not be so happy that they're in shared housing, but it isn't a shelter. And I think that's what we're seeing with shared housing, and thinking of that as the next place I live, but not the last place I live,
Yes.
right? And helping people. That's a real issue in the transition of, helping someone invest in a place that they don't love, that isn't their dream, that isn't
Yep.
the house with the pool, that isn't, and that they're settling, and because of backgrounds and eviction histories, they don't have their choice of nice places. So helping people see that if they can be successful here, get a landlord reference, then they have more options, save more money, get a better
Yeah.
job, right? So shared housing, while it's not transitional, so people could stay there as long as they want, but that the goal might be to move on. And in order to move on, they need to increase their income or connect to a housing subsidy, so that we don't say, well, too bad, you got to live here. That's your choice. So, and now come and see me for case management, like they're not going to engage with us if that's the kind of relationship. We want to acknowledge the reality that even if they're not in shared housing, they may not be like the neighborhood they're in. They may want to be in a better neighborhood. They may not really love the place they're in.
Want a
It may
bigger
not
place.
be maybe shabby. It may be, they may want a bigger place, right? They may want a sunny place. They may want a small garden apartment. They may want to live in a big tower, whatever. But, for a million reasons, it's not going to be people's ideal home, right? They've compromised. So that's the other thing too, is really if we're going to set goals related to housing, we want to know how this housing is working for people. And we want them to tell us the truth, so that we can actually use that to work together to get to what is closer to their ideal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I just want to quickly chime in. I think it's important when building the rapport with the clients in establishing a housing plan that they're very involved in it from the beginning and having a say in it. Because, I'd like to live in Beverly Hills too, but, I'm not going to, our goal is to never tell them they can't live somewhere. So that's why I like what you said, Stephen. It's just, I'm not saying that can't happen. It may not happen now, but based on what you have and the options that are available, let's make the decision together that you think that's viable, that you'll be able to live with or sustain, so they feel like they've had a part in making a decision to where they're going, even though it's not the best one. But yeah.
And they can
let me tell you
identify.
this story about this woman in LA who was homeless in a shelter, and she wanted to live in Malibu. Okay. All right. Well, did you think she found an apartment in Malibu? No, but they signed her up. There's actually a tiny little bit of public housing in Malibu. And after she lived in her apartment for a while, she got the public housing unit in Malibu. So, right, we don't want to say, no, you can't live in Beverly Hills. Maybe you're going to become a house sitter in Beverly Hills, and that's going to be where you're going to live. Who knows? But it's more about understanding that dream that person has and what they want, and then hooking this onto that dream, right? And what they really want in their life, and that this is a step. And most of us took a step that, was not our ideal place. Maybe some of us are still not in our ideal place, right? And people move. I mean, in New York City, people don't move because just the way it is. You just don't move. You just don't move, because then your rent goes up in an astronomical amount. But in most places, people do move, and seeing this as the step to the next place is really important.
And also with the share housing, I noticed that a lot of people are more open to the share housing. People are really starting to open up that third, second bedroom when kids went off to college, and turning garages into living spaces, the in-law unit. People are starting to be a little bit more open to bringing people in, when a while ago people wasn't doing that, and sharing their living spaces. But I see that there is a lot of share housing out there for people.
Well, we need alternatives to just straight old affordable housing, because there isn't enough. So, I know I know in Berkeley, they allow ADUs, like you could do an accessory dwelling unit, right? So you can expand the supply, but we really need everything we have, and we want to use everything we have, but we also want to be mindful that means helping people maybe find something else or plan for something else. So we may get them their next apartment, but not the last apartment again. So I know I'm watching time go by, and one of our rules is you would have to end on time, because that's your time, not our time. So I'm going to take the reins, Andrea, unless there's anybody else who has anything you want to say.
Nick did make a comment in the chat, but I think that we're going to have to come back to it next time. So I'm going to save that. And
just want to say what it is. Just say what it is.
Someone in my group shared about client experience with SLEs and the challenges the client faces while in that housing arrangement program. If they're willing to chime in, I thought it was a very well-made point in consideration.
Shared living experiences.
There we go. Okay.
Yes. Well, I know we're at the end of time, so we're gonna end because we know
Yeah.
you have other things that are going on. You can read the closing notes, and it's really, stuff we're gonna keep talking about.
Yep.
That this is about engaging with people as partners, to work a plan towards housing and connect them to resources. We have given you some citations, but also resources, the Critical Time Intervention website. And there is a global network of CTI practitioners and trainers that you can join that has a newsletter and, just gets you more connected, and an implementation manual and a Facebook connection. So we appreciate, I'm going to stop sharing, maybe turn your cameras on and say goodbye for a second. We really enjoyed our time with you today. Thank you so much
Absolutely.
for being a part of this with us.
Thank you
And I
for
hope
your
you guys have
time.
a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes,
a
thank you,
pleasure.
everybody.
See you next
I
week.
hope you get a lunch break today. How about
Yes.
that for a wish? A goodbye wish.
Teaching us, we
All right.
appreciate this.
Thanks, you
information.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week.
Yep. Okay.